when it comes to this debate, we have the creation versus evolution debate. And this is not necessarily, they're not totally monolithic. There's actually quite a lot of Christians who buy into the old earth evolutionary worldview. And to be fair to them, it can work, but as a system, it is set up in opposition to young earth creationism. For the longest time in Christian societies and Christian nations, young earth creationism was accepted pretty much on the whole. But with the skeptics, especially in the mid 1800s, they started to criticize scripture, started to throw out any kind of belief in the supernatural. You have they called it the Jesus seminars, where the critics would get around and they would basically, they sat at tables like this and they would read through the gospel accounts, and each person at the table had a stick with one end that was green and the other end that was red. And if they were reading a portion and they believed that it was fictitious because of some supernatural element, they would put the red end up. But if they got to a part that sounded like it was legitimate, maybe because it did express the criteria of embarrassment, then the critical scholars would turn it over and put the green side of the stick up.
I would just have my stick green up all the time.
Well, because you're not an atheist critic. But with the skepticism towards the supernatural that came into vogue during the mid 1800s, along with that came this big surge with Darwinian views of evolution. Charles Darwin was somebody who studied at a seminary, left the seminary, and went and started his own philosophy of how the life that we see around us could have evolved from non-life. And so he comes up with a philosophy. It's a theory that he came up with, and it became very popular because it was an answer to the existence of life without the requirement of a God. And so in the rejection of supernatural, they grabbed onto this evolutionary worldview and started plugging all of their scientific data into that worldview and seeing what came out of it.
Did he actually say the existence of life via non-life? Like, is that actually a quote? Like,
that's not a direct quote from him, but that's the purpose of his philosophy.
well, if he actually did say non-life, I would probably be like, are you okay, guy?
But that's what the majority of our evolutionary society believes now. The majority of scientists are evolutionists who believe that life came from non-life. So the fact that Darwin is the father of that system should not be surprising to us at all. And it was later in the early 1900s where especially I think around 1920, the gap theory became very popular as a Christian answer to old earth creationism, but then to give some way for evolution and the time it takes for evolution to occur. So the gap theory and the day-age theory were very popular even among fundamentalist Christians who wanted to stand on the supernatural. They still accepted either the gap or the day-age theory so that they could meld their biblical worldview with scientific philosophy. There are people who still go that way. William Lane Craig is one who has posited a way for Genesis 1 through 11 to be myth, and then everything after that to be true historical fact. And even in saying Genesis 1 through 11 is myth, William Lane Craig will still stand on the dogma that Adam and Eve are historical people. So he's got a very nuanced position, and he's got to split a lot of hairs to make it work, but there are born-again believers who stand on the existence of the supernatural, but still are not necessarily young earth creationists. Now, to that end, I'm not necessarily trying to set up the debate between two Christians who believe in old earth versus young earth. Right now, we're just going to take the two polar opposites and compare those views and work through how they answer the existence of life. So to that end, it will be creation versus evolution, mainly going with the primary popular atheist view of evolutionary origins. Now, in this system, it can be helpful to distinguish between methodological science and historical science. Methodological science goes out and it looks at the world around us, and it takes things that are observable, measurable, and repeatable, and it makes observations and tries to make predictions and then tests their observations against predictions to come to conclusions. That is good science. That's what you and I would say, yes, we believe in science. Let's go with legitimate scientific discovery, legitimate scientific facts. The other side is historical science that assumes that conditions have been constant throughout the existence of the world, and that with these constant conditions, if we go out into, say, the Nevada desert, and we take a soil sample and we test it for how much carbon-14 it has and compare that to how much carbon-13 is also in the soil, then we know the decay rate of these different carbons, and we can calculate how old that dirt is. That's how evolutionists often handle the dating of things, and they're just assuming that there are these carbon constants. Now, we know that carbon isn't constant, largely because of very simple things like the tarnishing of silver. Silver, if you put it out, it will begin to oxidize and collect carbon and tarnish, and it is not bright and shiny anymore. But before the Industrial Revolution, silver didn't tarnish. So one of the ways that you can test something, like they'll test coins that have supposedly been submerged for a really long time. One of the ways that you can test if it's a legitimate coin from like a shipwreck is if it has a lot of the carbon built up on the outside of the silver due to tarnishing. Because if it's been buried since before the Industrial Revolution, all the carbon is not in the atmosphere from coal and oil, and so those silver coins should not have tarnished. But if you come to expose it to post-industrial air, the silver is going to tarnish. So there's some very interesting things that you can come up with that we can prove there have been changes in our environment that changes the way nature interacts with itself. And so there's no such thing as a universal constant in nature. Things are often fluctuating and often changing, but they fluctuate and change based on the laws of nature. So let's just get into it. This is our introduction, and for our introduction, we're going to be focusing on the nature of our debate. Essentially, we have two worldviews that are at war. When it comes to this debate, we are debating the interpretations of evidence that are influenced by prior beliefs about reality and the supernatural. So this is a debate that is fundamentally worldview driven. Remember when we were talking about the approach to apologetics that is primarily presuppositional? So it's those things that you believed before you got into the conversation, before you looked at the evidence. What are your prior beliefs? What are your prior commitments? It can be really helpful to be able to identify your presuppositions when you're going into research, because then you can recognize where you're making conclusions based on your presupposition. The problem with a lot of evolutionary approaches is that the evolutionists are not aware that they have presuppositions that are clouding their decision making. And we'll get into how they inherited those presuppositions. But essentially, when it comes down to how you interpret the data, every interpretation of evidence is shaped by prior beliefs about reality, beliefs about authority, and your assumptions about the supernatural. This comes back to why Darwin created evolutionism in the first place. Why did he come up with evolutionary theory? He wanted a mechanism to where you could have all of the diversity of life that we see around us without the existence of the supernatural. So the fact that anyone who buys into his philosophy is going to have to accept the same materialist worldview should be something that's clear and obvious to anyone within the system. But because so many people teach that and believe that, it's the water that they're swimming in, and they don't even realize it. It's how you and I because we were born on planet Earth, we do not realize just how much weight our atmosphere is, to where when you lift your arm, there's actually enough air on top of your arm that you're technically lifting over 250,000 pounds because of all the air and the weight of the air that is above you in the atmosphere. But because this is the atmosphere we live in, we don't even think about how much the air weighs, and to us, it weighs nothing at all. So we would say, well, you know, that guy looks like he's as light as air. There's no weight to him. If you live in a certain environment, you don't even realize what's there because it's the water that you swim in. It's like a fish doesn't realize he's in water. So in the same way, evolutionists don't realize that they are in this water of an evolutionary worldview. They don't even realize that they're swimming in this water. But it is helpful for us to realize that the science and the interpretations of the data does not exist in isolation. So the interpretations that you're willing to make with the data have certain philosophical boundaries that limit what you're willing to say and the conclusions that you're willing to come to. So, for instance, you can have a creationist who looks at all the layers of the ice on the North Pole, and you can have an evolutionist who looks at all the layers of ice on the North Pole. And the evolutionist will say, wow, that must have taken millions of years to accumulate so much ice from all the snowfall. And the creationist will say, wow, right after the flood, there must have been this incredible time where there was kind of an ice age that probably existed on the face of the earth 5,000 years ago that would have deposited an incredible amount of ice up here. It's the same data. They're all looking at the same ice and the same ice layers, but they're interpreting what the data means. And it's when it comes to interpretation that these people are making different assumptions and coming to different conclusions. So the question then would be, if it's all the same data, how can two people look at the same evidence and come to radically different conclusions? It's like people have this idea that scientists, when they come up with, well, it took the platypus 13 million years to evolve. I'm coming up with that off the top of my head. It took so many million years for the platypus to evolve from an amoeba. People think that there's scientists going out and actually studying these intermediary forms between an amoeba and a platypus, or the intermediate forms, or that somehow we have observed a platypus turn into a duck. But the problem is that kind of observation has never happened. These scientists aren't making disinterested observations and conclusions. They're making an observation, but they're very interested in their own system. And so when they look at a platypus, they say, wow, this is an incredible intermediary form between an otter and a duck. And so this is proof that evolution is real because we see similar systems. Is that evidence of a common ancestor, or is it evidence of a common creator? If the same creator made multiple organisms to function in the same environment, then it makes sense that the same creator would have systems that operate and function in similar ways. These are all ways in which our presuppositions can influence both how evidence is categorized, but also how it's interpreted and then applied later down the line. So none of these evolutionary scientists are coming at it purely from a disinterested perspective. Essentially, our debate is worldview driven and not merely scientific. So presuppositions are shaping how evidence is categorized and applied in origin theories. This brings us to a question. What kind of limits does science have? So if we're talking about the system of science, creationists love science, evolutionists love science. What are the limitations of scientific observation? Off the top of your head, what are some things that science can never truly tell us?
What is love?
What is love? Excellent point. Scientists can observe love. They can quantify how much hormones are released in the brain when someone sees a person they love. They can tell you about what it feels like to be in love, but they cannot actually tell you what love is, not from scientific observation. That's a great example. Other areas would be things like our prior beliefs about reality. Science can't explain those philosophies. They can't explain authority or the possibility of the supernatural. If science is the study of the natural world, making observations, measurements, and repeating those experiments, if that's the realm of science, well, it can't touch anything in the supernatural realm. A philosopher on scientific philosophy, Paul Copan, says, science is incapable of speaking to a lot of things. And one of the first things he points out is the existence of the soul. I would hesitate a little bit to say that science can't have any evidence about the existence of the soul, but the rest of this is a great list. So he says science can't speak to a lot of things. Whether the soul exists, whether life has meaning, whether we have free will, whether beauty exists, how consciousness and free will emerged, or what caused the universe to exist in the first place. Science cannot even answer why, if science cannot answer these things, then why live within the limits of science alone? If science is limited to such a degree, why would we only study science? Why not study these other things that have meaning? Things like religion and philosophy that have a whole lot of payoff for the human experience that exist outside of the cold calculations of science. When we realize that we do have presuppositions, there is an impact on our scientific interpretations. Science does not operate within a vacuum, but within philosophical boundaries that guide what explanations are allowed to exist. So, when you look at the data, a evolutionist is limited by his worldview to be able to look at the science and say, well, it has to have some kind of a material cause because there's no such thing as the supernatural. And so he's making an assumption about the world before he even gets to the data. Now, if the science does point toward the existence of something supernatural, but the scientist is limited by his presuppositions, can he actually do legitimate science? Or is he always going to come to the wrong conclusions about what he's observing? If the evidence is pointing towards the supernatural, and it has a presupposition to not accept the supernatural, can he have this disinterested pursuit of fact and truth and follow it where it goes? He can't do that because he's limited by his beliefs about the supernatural. He cannot follow the evidence, and so he cannot perform good science. I'll give you an example of where science is pointing to the existence of the supernatural, and a lot of this comes from the study of neuroscience. So as people study the brain, there's a very interesting study that I've been excited about last couple of weeks. I might have told a couple of you about it, where the scientists come to a patient and they say, okay, we are going to present you with an opportunity. We're going to show you a donut. And if you want the donut, reach out and take the donut. And then for another group, they say, hey, we know that you like donuts too. We're going to present you with the temptation. When you see the donut, we want you to reach out, but then we want you to decide not to take the donut. After you reach for it, stop and don't take the donut. And between the two different parties, they hooked up all the brain monitors, and they're monitoring them and their brain wave activity. And there's this incredible spike when the temptation is presented. The donut is there, the people want the donut, they begin reaching for the donut. But between the two different parties, the party that decides not to take the donut has no additional brainwave activity. Their brain scan, the brainwave charts, match perfectly with the person who takes the donut. Well, if they're making a decision and they're choosing to not do something, wouldn't there be activity in the brain deciding not to do that thing? And this is where the scientists were baffled. They're like, why is there not additional brain activity? And they came to the conclusion that while the existence of free will is debated, this is evidence of the free won't. You can decide not to do something in somewhere that exists outside of your brain. You are making a choice that is not contingent on the physical world at all. So somehow there is some type of supernatural element to the human being that can decide not to do something. And that is as the scientists were quipping, the free won't of man, and evidence for the soul. Now, if you're a scientist who believes in the supernatural, you're like, oh yeah, the Bible told me about a soul. This is super easy. I don't really need to chase this thread any further. It makes total sense. The Bible says that there's a physical part to man and a supernatural part to man. And so when the supernatural part acts, I'm not surprised. That's what I expected in the first place. I can predict that there are things outside of the physical world. There is an element to man that is outside of the physical world. And there we have evidence for it. So the creationists are not surprised. On the other hand, the evolutionists have no idea what to do with this data. They kick the can down the road and they say, well, at some point, someone is going to make a scientific observation. There will be some study that comes to the bottom of this conundrum. But at this point, we don't have the solutions yet. And so they have this faith-based assumption that somewhere down the line, somebody else is going to figure it out. So working with the idea of the limitations of science, there's a really influential scientific philosopher out there named Stephen Meyer. If you're interested in this stuff, I highly recommend go find him. He's got great YouTube videos. But Stephen Meyer identifies the foundational failures of evolution. He points out that evolutionists have a position that is historically inherited rather than philosophically justified. So if they can't fully justify their scientific position from philosophy, why do so many of these scientists accept that evolution is the origin of life on Earth? They accept it because that's what they were taught. And why are they accepting what they were taught? Well, the people who were taught before them accepted what they were taught. And it goes back to this big chain down the line, back to Darwin and his co-workers who all believed that they could come up with some way that life exists without the supernatural. But it's been over 150 years now, and as research has continued to progress, we keep coming to these dead ends in science that point to the supernatural, but the scientists simply don't want to accept it because of their presuppositions and because of what they've historically inherited, and so they quit pushing on that front of the research, and they'll try to find some other explanation, some other solution for how something could have happened. Additionally, Stephen Meyer points out that evolutionists can't accept intelligent causation because they have an inherited naturalist worldview. So if they look at a system that is incredibly complex, that requires an intelligent designer, they assume that it came about through natural processes. It came about through evolution. Why do they make that assumption? Because their presuppositions limit them and they cannot accept an intelligent causation. There are evolutionists who are willing to bend a little bit on this, and they'll say, well, life on Earth couldn't have been created by God because God doesn't exist, but maybe it was caused by an alien. Maybe an alien came here and designed life as we know it. Okay, so we're getting an intelligent cause, but who created the alien? Aliens, according to our philosophy, are not self-existent creatures. They would have had to have come from some other natural material cause, and there's no natural cause that can create life or intelligence. So if there's no known natural cause to bring about these things, why would we make the assumption that it's an alien that brought life to Earth? Unless you simply want to reject God. So again, we're going right back to the presuppositionalism. Stephen Meyer goes on. He points out that evolutionists can't pursue truth in good faith investigation because they must ignore the supernatural explanations for the data, even if it's the best explanation. So you can see how a lot of these philosophical stepping stones that Stephen Meyer is putting out is coming from his study into DNA. He's looking at DNA as this incredibly complex, intelligently designed code that there is no known natural process which can accidentally cause DNA. And he's looking at DNA and saying the existence of DNA itself is enough evidence for an intelligent cause for some supernatural being that I intellectually must accept that there is a creator. Based on the rational grounds, the evidence is pointing to the existence of God, and I can't deny it. And there is a big wave of scientists that are beginning to be influenced by these arguments, where even people that, when I was a kid, were atheists and very happy in their atheism, are coming to the point of saying, you know what? There is a supernatural element that I've been ignoring my whole life, and maybe this new atheism isn't actually all it's cracked up to be. And a lot of scientists on the research end are starting to be pulled toward a creationist worldview. Evolutionists can't do good science because they inherited assumptions that exclude intelligent causes, even when that is the best explanation for the evidence. And in conclusion, Stephen Meyer posits that if the goal of science is truth, scientists seeking genuine explanations must follow the most reasonable explanation for the evidence. So if you want to do good science, if you really want to research things, you have to follow the evidence. If you are willing to ignore the evidence for the supernatural, then what you're doing is not good science, and you probably shouldn't call yourself a scientist. What you really are doing is a kind of superstition. Does all that make sense? So these hard and fast materialist scientists, when you break down their philosophy, can you all see how they're really quite superstitious? And their superstition is the materialist worldview, but it's ignoring good, hard scientific data. As we go, this is our foundational conversation, but as we go, what I will be seeking to do as we go through the evidence of creation is to identify these different evidences from creation that point us to the existence of a creator. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, night unto night showeth forth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out into all the earth." Based on that scripture, just by looking at creation, you have to be able to conclude that there's a creator. And the more that we learn about science, the clearer it becomes that the materialist worldview cannot account for the existence of matter, the existence of life, or the ability of life to go from a single organism to all of the different millions of species that we see today. It is simply impossible for that to happen in a materialist worldview. So this brings us to a big question. This is really the heart of the debate. What is our ultimate authority? We can ask the question, does authority come from divine revelation only? Does authority come from divine revelation or only from autonomous human reason? Can man, independent of God, be completely authoritative on his own? No. That's why these materialists have come to a postmodern worldview. People say, oh, well, that's your truth. I'm sorry that you feel that way. What your truth isn't my truth. I believe that everyone is part of this world's soul, and we'll all just be reunited with the soul someday. And that's my truth because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. But you can believe in your God as long as your God doesn't say that you have to raise your kids to not be homosexuals. If your God restricts the practice of homosexuality even on your kids, well, now you're evil and abusive, and we have to ostracize you and say that you're part of this other group. And really, you're hurting more people than you're helping, and you're a blight on society. So we have the right to imprison, abuse, and in some cases even execute you for your beliefs. That's where the materialist, naturalist worldview takes you. It brings you to this view of truth that has no ground or foundation. So truth itself is something that is interpreted for each person as they deem fit. If you think that things work that way, well, that's fine for you, and we'll just go on from here. At the heart of the debate lies the question of ultimate authority. Does it rest in divine revelation or autonomous human reason? In this debate, we see biblical creation beginning with God as the self-existent creator. On the other hand, you have evolutionary theory that assumes that matter is self-existent and thinks that matter is all that exists. And if you want to find an inconsistency in their worldview, go and look at their search for dark matter. There's something out there, we don't know what it is. It makes up, there is 5 times more dark matter in existence than real matter, the matter that we can see and feel, but we just can't see it, we can't test it, we can't measure it. So they keep building these bigger and bigger particle accelerators. They're pouring billions of dollars. The taxes that, when you have a job, the taxes you pay are going to fund these big experiments to try and find some kind of dark matter somewhere in the world. And despite all of their research, the giant facilities they've built, the billions of dollars they've poured into it, they still haven't been able to actually identify dark matter. Well, that would be an inconsistency with the evolutionist worldview, because their system is based on the fact that the only thing that exists is the material world and the matter that we can see, observe, taste, touch, feel, smell. Nothing else exists. If you start in these 2 different locations, you're going to end up at different destinations. So we have these starting points, and they're going to determine the interpretive framework and which conclusions are acceptable. For a creationist, Scripture provides the foundation for understanding our origins. And it's significant to note that science as we know it grew out of the Christian worldview. Nobody was doing science the way that we are today, with the different research and lab and recording information, like we're doing until the Protestant Reformation. With the Protestant Reformation came the belief that everyone needed access to the Word of God for themselves, and so it was the Protestants who began teaching people how to read. And it was the Catholics who believed that there is this really consistent world that works according to certain laws of nature, because they believe that there's a consistent God who made all of it, who's the same, who doesn't change yesterday, today, and forever. God is always the same. So with these foundations of a Christian worldview, people started studying nature. They started doing scientific research, and it is out of the Christian worldview that we started to be able to make inventions and use science to fuel these incredible discoveries we have, to be able to come up with technology and cell phones and trains and aircraft. All of that lends credit back to its Christian origins. Alternatively, evolutionists rely on naturalistic assumptions. So they say that only the natural world exists, and somehow everything comes from the material world. The problem is with the scientific worldview, or the naturalistic worldview, there's no way to explain where matter itself came from. That's something that they accept as a miracle. And there are scientific philosophers on the atheist side who even admit, hey, we don't know where the matter came from, but here's some plausible explanations. And they'll go into ideas about string theory and the Big Bang to try and make it work. But ultimately, there's no scientific evidence that points towards the material origin of the universe. Between creationism and evolutionism, we see a significant difference. This divergence between the two views shapes not only scientific interpretation, but also philosophical and moral outlooks, making the debate stretch beyond biology or cosmology. So our debate is not just about whether a platypus has a venomous sting or not. We're not concerned about whether or not the sun is made up of helium. The questions that we're dealing with between creationists and evolutionists lie a whole lot more in the realm of philosophy. So, for our own pursuit and understanding, we can look at the foundations of creationism. So we'll hopefully make it through this slide and one more slide, and then we'll have to go to the next service. But looking at the foundations of creationism, we can build our worldview from two different starting points. One, this is the presuppositionalist view. We need to start from what the Bible says. So let's go and look at the Bible, and when we read, we see biblical creation starts with a self-existent God who creates all things by the word of his mouth. Genesis 1 and 2 record eyewitness testimony from God about how he created the world. So if God is real, if he exists, then his record of how he created everything is a eyewitness testimony, is it not? And if God is truth, then we can believe his eyewitness testimony, correct? So this would be the presuppositionalists' starting point. They will also say that the biblical records record measurements and observations of God in his scientific act of creation. Just because you can't observe, measure, or repeat something does not make it unscientific. And let me replace the emphasis. Just because you can't observe, measure, and repeat something does not make it unscientific. Do you think God could observe creation? What about measurements? Can God measure creation? Do you think God could repeat creation? You want evidence of God being able to repeat creation? Look at Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. He's creating matter in a way that only God can do. Out of all the people that do these miracles today, nobody is creating new bread. They can take flour and yeast and mix it up and make bread, but they can't create new bread quite like Jesus did. But as creator, these are things that he can repeat. So, when we look at Scripture, what we actually see is a measurable, observable, and repeatable experiment. But it's only measurable, observable, and repeatable from God's perspective. From our perspective, we can't cause those things. So we do have to accept what God said about himself. Now, this is where people will often point to the resurrection as the chief proof for Christianity, because how do we know that we can trust this God and not some other God? How do we know that our God is the real God? Well, to come to that conclusion, let's look at the evidence, shall we? Let's go and look. Who else has evidence of an incredible miracle like someone raising himself from the dead? Buddha didn't do that. Nobody else has any kind of evidence to point towards that type of thing. When we look at the verifiable existence of prophecy that told the future before the future happened, how could you foretell something without true supernatural power? Nobody else does that kind of thing except the Bible. So if the Bible is the one recording all of this for us, we can see that the prophecy was true. We can see the evidence of Jesus' resurrection. Well, this brings us back to the conclusion that Genesis is actual history written by a real living God. Now, that's coming at the proof for the existence of God from the presupposition that God exists and that he showed himself to us in Scripture. Starting simply from the evidential side, you can take scientific experiment and follow the chain back to the existence of God and the truth of the Bible. So starting from science, we can observe the countless systems and organisms that require irreducible complexity. Okay, so you evolved from a sponge, right? But you don't have blood. How long are you going to survive? You're not, right? Okay, so you evolved from an amoeba. How long can the species of humanity exist with only one gender? Because both genders would have had to evolve at the same time, but evolving a sexual reproductive system takes millions of years. So the odds of having a male and a female evolved at the same time is really unlikely. So let's say that the male side evolved first. How long does that species continue while it's waiting for the female side to evolve? You're not going to have a reproductive population if you have male and female. It doesn't work that way. So here's a really complex system that you can't remove one component from and still have life. So let's look at the evidence that we have and see there is irreducible complexity in the natural world. We can surmise that the only way for these things to exist is from an intelligent mind. So this is actually a very reasonable conclusion. And from that, we can surmise that an intelligent being who fine-tuned so many systems for our benefit must care very much about us, right? If he put so much care into creating this world that exists at the perfect distance from the sun, at the perfect tilt so that it doesn't boil, at the perfect distance so it doesn't get tidally locked and burn one side and freeze the other, all of these different components are in their proper place. Well, if he created the perfect environment for you to live with the right oxygen and nitrogen concentrations so that an explosion doesn't just blow up the universe or the world, or that breathing the air doesn't, or we have air to breathe, we have oxygen in the atmosphere, or that there's not so many heavy metals in the atmosphere that as soon as we take our first breath, it suffocates us. With all of these different fine-tuned elements of our environment, very clearly the person who designed all of that must care very much about you. So if he cares so much about you, wouldn't he reveal himself to you? And if you go and you look into all of the world religions and look into which one is the most plausible, which one comes to the best conclusions about how God revealed himself to you, what you come up with is the Old and New Testament. You come up with the Bible. So starting from science, what is observable and measurable and repeatable, you end up with a Christian worldview. That is a very reasonable, actually I would argue it is the most reasonable way to get from simple scientific observation all the way to believing that Jesus Christ died on the cross to save me from my sin. So these are the philosophical underpinnings that are foundational for creationism. As we go to our final slide for today, we can look at the foundations of evolution. Evolution posits that there is only the material world. The matter is self-existent, and they have to rely on naturalistic assumptions for interpreting origins. So when you hear people describe the Big Bang, what does that story sound like? Remember, it's not a scientific observation. It's not a history. When they talk about the Big Bang, what they're describing is a story. So what fictional story do they tell you when they tell you how evolution happened? Or sorry, how the Big Bang happened? In the beginning, there was what? There was a bang. Well, what happened before the bang? Nothing. So in the beginning, there was nothing, and then there was something. Oh, well, in the beginning, there was a Big Bang that created something. Well, where did that explosion come from? Well, it came from a speck. Well, why would that speck explode? And where did the speck come from? Well, it's just always existed. Well, how has it always existed? And so they'll come up with this idea that maybe the universe is expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting, and we're just one in an infinite number of Big Bangs, and we happen to be the one where life evolved on planet Earth. Okay, so where did the first Big Bang come from? You keep kicking the can down the road that there's been a bunch of Big Bangs, and once gravity compresses everything back down to a tiny speck again, there's going to be another Big Bang that creates matter all over. Well, where did the first Big Bang come from? How far back can we go? Because they don't have any kind of natural law that can explain the existence of something outside of matter. Natural law can only rule over matter. Natural law cannot rule over the supernatural because that's outside of its realm. That's in the word, natural versus supernatural, outside of nature. So they make the assumption that only the material world exists. Supernatural forces do not influence the natural world, and ultimately they have to come back to a blind faith conclusion. What miracle do evolutionists have to accept before they can have the existence of any matter whatsoever? They need a miracle. They're not saying that there's no such thing as miracles, because the origin of the evolutionary worldview has a miracle. Their miracle is that something came from nothing, and they accept that on blind faith. Nobody told them, there's no authority. Christians have an authority who says that God created the world. God is the authority who told us, hey, I created all this. And we can either believe God or not believe God. Evolutionists don't have an authority who says that. Evolutionists have philosophers who say, well, maybe this is where everything came from. And based on a maybe, they accept that as scientific fact. That is called blind faith. So while they accuse Christians of blind faith, we actually have a whole lot more sound reason to believe in a God who created the universe than they have in the belief that something created or nothing created something. They need at least one miracle. But as we go forward in the following weeks, we're going to see the number of incredible miraculous events that evolutionists demand for their system to be able to work. And when you follow the evidence, you will see how their system does not work. It breaks down and it fails to answer the questions that man is ultimately asking. We have these big questions of who am I? What is my purpose? Where did I come from? And where am I going? The evolutionary worldview simply can't answer those things. They can observe that we have planet Earth orbiting the sun, and they can work out the math for how long it's going to take for that cycle to continue to exist. They can calculate how fast the moon is distancing itself from Earth. But to answer the most important life questions, evolution and science have no way to answer those things. Essentially, what we see forming as we look at the evidence is that there are holes in the naturalist worldview, and they have to accept on blind faith that those holes will be filled in through further scientific investigation. As a result of their presuppositions, they have a filter with which they interpret all of the data. Either starting with creationism or materialism, there are different ways that we can interpret the evidence and which conclusions we can find acceptable. When scientific investigation points towards the supernatural, the materialist has to put on a blindfold and ignore the evidence, where the creationist actually has some very good ground for saying that his views, his beliefs, are scientific and are concrete. So when you look at the evolutionist perspective, does it sound like what they're doing in science is purely disinterested investigation of the facts? They can't do disinterested investigation. Their worldview won't allow them to. Can creationists have disinterested investigation of the facts? No, we can't either. But at least we can acknowledge what our presuppositions are. And that gives us more understanding than what's available from the evolutionary perspective. And we could go into further, we don't have time to, but how would these biases affect our philosophy? And more importantly, what's downstream of philosophy? how do these biases affect our morality? There are significant consequences to the evolutionary atheist worldview. What is murder? What is fornication? What is adultery? Are these things bad? Why are they bad? You see how their presuppositions are based on rejecting God and ultimately lead to a conclusion where they can live without God. Well, I want to be able to live a promiscuous life, so I don't want a God that tells me that's wrong. And so I buy into the evolutionary worldview. There are very dangerous consequences to what you believe, which is why conversations about politics and religion, philosophy, the boring things of life are actually the most meaningful and important conversations people can have. And on a very practical application level, the fact that people are unwilling to engage in conversations about politics and religion today are actually very dangerous. And it leads to people dying because nobody is being able to prosecute our worldview to see where our weaknesses are, and they're also not allowing their own worldview to be prosecuted. So everyone, rather than being answerable to some kind of rational investigation, rather than having to defend their views in a debate, they can do whatever is right in their own eyes, and they don't have to be held up to scrutiny. So in fact, the creationist worldview is very rational. And I would say it's the most rational perspective there is, and it points to the existence of God and that we are responsible to him. So where did we come from? We were created by God. What is our purpose? To glorify God. And where are we going? To dwell with God forever. So that's what we got for this week. Next week we'll get into an overview of the two different positions, but that's good enough for now. Let's have James. Why don't you pray to close us out?